Okay, good morning everyone, and welcome to the fourth in our series of Clyde.Scot Clyde Sustainable Shipping webinars. My name is Ian McGilvray. I'm the Executive Director of CDPI, the Clyde Docks Preservation Initiative. And my colleague Liz Gardner and I will be hosting today's guest panelist presentations and discussion session. We're delivering a series of webinars this year in the run-up to the COP26 Climate Change Conference in Glasgow, which we're quietly confident will still be taking place in November as planned, despite the COVID situation. And these webinars are focused on reducing emissions from shipping and what opportunities there are in that for the Clyde. And these are the webinars that we've delivered so far. And you can see the recordings of these on the Clyde.Scot YouTube channel. And you can find the link to this on the Clyde.Scot website. And I'll put up the link to that at the end. And we do have more upcoming webinars in the series with some alterations to our original schedule. The schedule is under review and still to be confirmed, subject to availability of panelists. And these are the topics that we've still to cover. And these are the provisional dates, including the webinars that we've had so far. But today we're looking at the urban river as a passenger transport corridor, and we aim to encourage wider discussion about why this exists in so many other river cities, but not in the Clyde. And so I'm now going to hand over to Liz to introduce our guest panelists.
Thanks very much, Ian. And as Ian said, I'm Liz Gardner. I'm the Secretary of Clyde Docks Preservation Initiative. And our first speaker this morning is Sean Collins, who is the CEO of Uber Boat by Thames Clippers. Sean was apprenticed by his father to the company of Waterman and Lighterman in 1984 as a third-generation waterman. Having spent his early career working on the River Thames, he saw the opportunity to build a professionally run, high-speed passenger ferry service. He co-founded Thames Clippers in 1999 and built it, building it up from a single catamaran to a fleet of 21 vessels. By 2019, when COVID-19 interrupted play, passenger numbers on Uber Boat by Thames Clippers had reached 4.3 million. Sean was appointed waterman to Her Majesty the Queen in February 2008. So it's my great honour to welcome Sean Collins. Over to you, Sean.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that introduction. I'm just trying to share my presentation. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see that.
Yeah. Yes.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me along, Clyde Sustainable Shipping webinar, to talk about Uber Boat by Thames Clippers and fast ferry operations on a city river. So without no further ado, I will start my presentation. I think the introduction has already been done about me, so I'll skip that one. So the fleet and route span across the years sort of started with focusing on areas of river developments, both commercial, residential, and cultural, that were poorly served by other forms of transport, and identifying those niche markets and being able to deliver a frequent river service to those locations. In 2002, we probably see the largest expansion of the service down to the east east of the Thames barrier to a housing development known as the Royal Woolwich Arsenal. As I just mentioned, it was extremely poorly served by other forms of transport, and therefore opened an opportunity to start a river bus service there that was initially supported by the developer and then subsequently the local council. And then in 2006, there was a destination on that route called the Dome that many of you may remember, that was acquired and turned into the O2, which is now known as the world's leading entertainment venue. In connection with that, the business was majority acquired, purchased by the owners of the O2, the Ancients Entertainment Group, in sharing the vision for a river service. There was significant investment in at that stage. We were carrying 1 million passengers. We had 7 vessels, and we heavily invested in 6 new vessels to serve the Greenwich Peninsula and the O2 with a fast and frequent service. This then benefited all of those other sites that we were concurrently operating to and from at that point. Today, we operate a 20-minute frequency between all key London piers. Our route span is 25 kilometres long, and we operate that with 20 vessels over 23 piers. That represents an investment of circa 100 million in both pier infrastructure and fleet development. Our routing is broken up into 3 zones: eastern, central, and western zones, with 2 main routes that go from the west and from the east and overlap in the middle. So the RB1 goes from Woolwich Arsenal in the east as far as Battersea Power Station in the west, and RB6 goes from Putney in the west down as far as Canary Wharf in the east. We're probably the only form of transport that you can get on and do those trips without any change. So once again, offering a real seamless offering of transport to our customers. And what we've done is we aligned the business with that of the wider transport network, breaking it up into zones that also denote the fare structure. So a fare in one zone, traveling in one zone will be one price, and then crossing subsequent zones will increase. We have the contactless and Oyster system that is very familiar to all across the TfL network, that allows people seamless touch in, touch out payment methods, which actually increases the efficiency as well of our service, making it a seamless process for people to board and alight the vessels. The routing has grown over the years and has passenger numbers. And you will see here from those early days to 2019, a significant growth. Now, all of that growth has come from the investment, expansion of routes, addition of piers, and probably the most significant growth was, as I mentioned, in 2006, when AEG acquired the business and invested in doubling the fleet at that point. As you can see, that quickly grew and delivering 2.5 million passengers by 2008. The business then continued to grow through our servicing of additional piers throughout the routes that I just mentioned. And probably the next most significant change was the introduction of RB6 in 2013, which you can see spiked it up again. And subsequently, the success of that route required additional vessels, additional capacity, which has continued to drive those numbers up until when COVID struck. but nevertheless, when you look at the fact that we've pretty much not been operating for 7 months of 2020, I'm still proud of what we have achieved in that period, because we've been operating less services, less fleet, yet still carried a reasonable number of passengers. The benefits of river travel are endless. And I think these two pictures sort of demonstrate that. We have a congested road in the city, and we have a relatively clear highway of river going through it. And you know, it is tidal, so at the peaks of tides, there is quite a lot of freight movement on the river, so it isn't totally empty all of the time. But with the investment in central London piers and access to those piers, there is a lot of opportunity to even expand it beyond what we see today. And we don't experience those congestions that you do on the road. So we have significantly contributed towards getting people off the roads, out their cars, onto a form of transport that sort of does relatively replicate that of their car, a personal space, no overcrowding. And to that point, you know, we have done extremely well when we've operated during COVID because of the naturally social distance aspects of river travel. We have reduced our passenger numbers to improve that even more, to well below 1 person per square metre. But in normal conditions, we denote 1.4 people per square metre. And if you can compare that, that was what they achieved. They were striving to achieve on the tube at 1.3 during COVID. So, you know, it demonstrates what a naturally social distance service we provide, and that lends very much to people wanting to get out of their cars and get on this form of transport. We provide a significantly enhanced customer experience. So whether you're a commuter, whether you're a family, whether you're an individual, just wanting to get from A to B, and the other real great aspect of river travel, the fact that you can access the vessels by our boarding system that allows disability passengers very easy of access. And we also provide services for school children, school groups, and you know, parties of groups that are traveling together. Is a very common theme throughout the leisure side of our business. We have a very diverse ticketing platform to run alongside this, to make a seamless journey for our customers. As I mentioned, we have the well-recognized Oyster and contactless, but we also have our own app. We have the Uber app, so any Uber customers can click on that and use the vessels as well. And what we've also recently developed is a ticketing reader that allows our partners, our third-party sales and destination partners, to sell a ticket that then can be scanned prior to the customer boarding, that recognise the origin of that ticket and makes it seamless for that customer that is visiting the capital to travel by river. We also connect London by bike, and that is an extremely growing entity for us. We have 15 bike racks on the vast majority of our fleet. So people that, you know, are not within walking distance of the piers can cycle, and some cycle up to 15-20 minutes to then get on the boat and complete their journey. So another way in which we are enticing people off of the other crowded forms of transport and off the roads to get on a bike for a relatively short distance and then complete their journey relaxed by river. Some choose to leave their bikes at the origin, some choose to take them with them so that they'll continue their journey at the other end. but there are also many that are that have access to the Santander and Jump cycle schemes. So we have a Santander cycle docking station within 3 or 4 minutes walk of 80% of our peers throughout our central and western extremity routes. London is also full of attractions, and we link those attractions by river. So this is where it fits extremely well with our commuters, AM and PM, and then carrying tourists, leisure seekers, and people just making a journey between a place of residence, hotel, to the cultural offering of London. And you can see here that the vast majority of the major tourist attractions in London, from the O2 in the east as far as Battersea Power Station there in the west, can be connected by river. Now, we call these the string of pearls, and I usually get quite a wow factor from this slide that I'm presenting now. But it really just does just, and this is just a few of the great destinations that we serve. As I said, from Battersea Power Station there on the right, down as far as Greenwich, the Thames Barrier, and the National Maritime Museum, and the Royal Naval College at Greenwich. So, and until we were operating, you had the river tour services, but they were an attraction within themselves. What we do, providing a 20-minute frequency and sometimes 15 in peak periods, to connect in Tower Pier with Greenwich and with the fantastic attractions there that I just mentioned. It really allows people to get that journey time is 20 minutes. So it really allows people to get from central London attractions down to and out of central London, which once again has been extremely popular because of the open spaces during COVID. The key ticketing partnerships have been extremely important for us as well, commercially, whether it be a residential housing development, a company in Canary Wharf, or whether it be the attractions like up the O2, the Emirates airline, or the London Eye. We work with them closely, and we join them up, and we have partnership agreements with them to support their business and for us to allow people to easily access theirs. And the housing development there down on the right that you can see is Barking Riverside. Now, this development is underway, it's under construction, probably about 15% complete at this stage. We start operating that later this year. It will have 11,000 properties, 30,000 occupants, and only 2 major forms of transport, one being river. So fantastic opportunity there to grow river transport out even further east. That's 6 kilometres beyond our existing stop. Now, as I mentioned, we've had to adapt to change. So we have changed our season ticket to carnet tickets. We've promoted park and glide, so trying not to bring vehicles into central London and congesting the centre parts of London. We're also supporting the returns of schools and preparing for them being able to continue their trips. So park and glide for coaches, where they can park 3 at the O2 and then continue their journey on into central London by Clipper. And as I mentioned, we've also added to our capacity for cycles on board. Turn to the environment, which is extremely important. And whilst we're a very naturally sourced operation, operating on a natural highway, the River Thames here in London, we have the ability to meander up the river throughout our routes, serving both sides of the river. So where you would have to have 2 routes of buses serving both sides of the river, you would have to cross the river at some point through tunnels or through bridges. River transport really lends well in supporting boroughs and destinations either side of the river. It really brings communities together and provides flexible transport to, in other words, the river, it doesn't have to be a barrier. And so that's really important. We have reduced, as I've mentioned previously, we heavily reduced congestions on other forms of transport. But turning to what we're doing and looking forward to emission reduction, we've already started with retrofitting existing vessels with moderner engines, with catalytic converting systems, SCRs, but we're taking that to the next stage. We're just about to embark on ordering new vessels that will be hybrid. So they will operate at high speed on these engines that I've just mentioned that have already significantly reduced tailpipe emissions. But when they're in central London, they will be operating on battery. So that will be totally tailpipe zero. Our ultimate aim is to get to an entire journey of tailpipe zero. So our next plan for vessels that are built 2025 and beyond is hydrogen fuel cell. We really see that as the future of propulsion, fuel propulsion for us. And why is that? Because it's a big balancing act. If we loaded the boats up with batteries, they would be unstable with the same amount of passengers that we would normally carry. So it's important that we carry our passengers, but we can't have both. So we've got to balance this up with technology, and we've got to make sure that we meet the regulations, the high-speed craft code, and the MCA's requirements to deliver such services that we currently do. But we cannot do that without a levelling up. We need to have a fair playing field, and we need to have the support from the boroughs and central government and Transport for London to ensure that river is given the opportunity equal to that of all of the other forms of transport in central London and out to the suburbs. I'd like to thank you now for allowing me to present and pass back to Liz.
Thanks so much, Sean. Gosh, it's really clear what an important element of the COVID recovery the river transport is. And I think you've given us all, whetting our appetites for tourism again, for coming to London to see all these wonderful sites. Thank you so much for that. So next we've got James Trimmer. He's Director of Planning and Environment for the Port of London Authority. He's a chartered surveyor and a town planner. James joined the Port of London Authority in 1999 and is their Director of Planning and Environment. He's responsible for the authority's approach to strategic planning, infrastructure, transport, and environmental issues on the tidal River Thames and its riparian hinterland, including the commitment to achieving net zero. James is responsible for permissions for river works and dredging under the Port of London Act of 1968. And he's the project director for the authority's role on both the Thames Tideway Tunnel and Tilbury 2 infrastructure schemes. So welcome, James, and the platform's yours.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm hoping that the screen will be shared and my slides will appear. I'm not as technologically savvy as Sean. So hopefully that will come soon. And thank you very much. If I can just note as well that I think Sean has covered the passenger transport element, which I appreciate is a major part of today. So what I'm going to look at instead, which I hope will be of value and use to you, is to consider the issues that we faced on the river in relation to the protecting of riparian land for cargo handling and other necessary infrastructure uses, particularly from alternative development, particularly residential development, of course. And that's something that that London has seen really since the start of London Docklands, so the beginning of the 1980s, when effectively London became perhaps the first post-industrial city to an extent. A lot of its frontages, particularly in London, were of old docks, warehouses, and again these were regenerated by the London Docklands Development Corporation, and actually made living next to the water a thing. And of course, that thing has proved remarkably popular. And that development pressure that we've seen on the river, and we've now had it for 40 odd years, I think is effectively everywhere. People like living next to the river, but what that means is that there are issues both in terms of what happens on the river and also in terms then of the development pressure that results in that. So if I can have the first slide, please, from that introduction. Thanks. Oh, it was there a minute ago. It's gone. Thank you. And effectively here, what we're talking about is effectively what the PLA has promoted through its current Thames vision, which effectively, of course, is like most port authorities, to increase the use of the river. In terms of the port itself, we've got London Gateway Port, the first new container terminal in the UK for a generation. Other major developments in terms of inland freight, which is a particular interest of mine. The river handles between 3.5 and 5 million tonnes a year, principally bulks, aggregates, waste, albeit now containerised. And a lot of project-related cargo, as referred to the Thames Tideway Tunnel. In 2019, almost 2.2 million tonnes of project cargo were put onto the river from that one infrastructure project. Of course, passenger transport, as Sean refers to, effectively to look to double that till 2030, and of course also for leisure and recreation uses. And of course, I couldn't have any presentation without noting that London in 2020 returned to, in my view, its rightful position as the UK's largest port, handling just under 50 million tonnes. A very varied basis of cargo as well. So that's effectively, we are looking to grow the river. The next slide, please. And of course, to grow the river, you need to have principally wharves, terminals on the river. As it's been pointed out a number of times, both to me and to others. The river, of course, is a motorway heading east to west. So we've got the major international gateways in the east. All the way up, we have commercial terminals as far as Wandsworth, so a major linear port. And it's all well and good having this great waterway with a sort of 4 or 5 miles an hour moving with the tide, and a tidal range of 6 or 7 meters in central London. All well and good having this, but it's no good if you can't get off it. And of course, for that, what we need to have is wharves and terminals. And what the PLA was finding, because of this regeneration that I referred to, there was a massive disparity in land values. And at one point, it would have been in the last but one property boom, so sort of pre-2008, the difference in land values between what one could achieve for, say, industrial, for cargo handling uses, and what one could achieve for residential value was about 18 times. Okay, so therefore, there is this huge drive, effectively, to displace wharves and terminals on the river with alternative development. And here we have a classic example. This was Express Wharf, London Steel Terminal on the Isle of Dogs. And that's as it was. Okay, and you can probably imagine what the next slide is going to be, but if I can have the next slide, please. And this is it now. And of course, you can see there in perhaps if you look close up, in the classic way of all seafarers, the graffiti of visiting vessels along the river wall, and that is as much as we have now. So the PLA looked to see what it could do, because clearly if this effectively acquisition of these wharves was to continue, then sooner or later, probably sooner, there would be nothing left actually to handle cargo on the river. So what we did was to effectively lobby government, and at this time we didn't actually have any regional planning. The GLC had been abolished at that point. So we had to do it effectively through government offices in order to put in place some form of mechanism that we would be able to prevent or at least limit or properly examine the degree to which terminals on the river, particularly in London, this is where at that time the major development pressure was, that the planning of those terminals and particularly their change from effectively industrial to residential could be further examined. And what we effectively came up with was what were known as, or what are known as, planning directions. So effectively ministerial directions that effectively now through the mayor give us in planning policy terms a route by which we can examine whether the proposals to lose a wharf and to ensure it's kept in cargo handling are actually checked, and if necessary, intervention is made. The next slide, please. So now what we have in London is about 45 wharves that are known as safeguarded wharves and effectively are protected for cargo handling. This is a system that's undertaken through the Mayor of London. And in the London plan, there are very strict policies in terms of the protection of wharves. And effectively what this policy says, that if a cargo handling wharf is viable or capable of being made viable for cargo handling, that's the use that will remain in, and all other proposals will be refused. Now, for those who know their planning, that is about as strong as a planning policy gets. A very strict black and white test. And that test is undertaken again on a series of criteria that are noted within the London plan, but they relate to the wharf's viability for cargo handling, not for what alternative use it could make, not for the financials, but its viability for cargo handling. And we are the Mayor's advisors on these wharves. And the position is that if the Mayor is not content in terms of a change of use from a wharf to an alternative development, then the Mayor can direct that local planning authority in London to refuse the application. So again, we have a very strong policy basis and a very strong powers of direction, negative powers as planning tends to be, powers of direction to refuse a scheme. And the wharf you see here, this is actually a wharf in Wandsworth, London Borough of Wandsworth, immediately upstream of Wandsworth Bridge. The Ship pub is immediately upstream of this, and for those who visited Thames pubs, it's one of the finest in my view. And this is Pier Wharf, which is a Hanson aggregates terminal. And you can see downstream of it, major residential development. If you look upstream of it, you will see major residential development. Behind it, much the same. And this wharf, which handles about 150,000 tonnes of aggregates, which are transshipped from Dagenham in East London to this wharf on a 24/7 basis. If that direction wasn't in place, I can guarantee that this wharf would now not be working. And as Sean has noted, the sustainable transport benefits of using the water would not be realised. So we have a very strong series of protection. The wharves, the directions are updated and they've recently been reviewed and accepted by government. So those are all now in place. We have a very new evidence base to support this protection, but it's been a long process. I joined the PLA, as Liz said, in 1999. The safeguarding directions came in place in 1997, and we have spent a lot of work to actually maintain them. We went through a major public inquiry where we and the GLA won. That's actually established this. The next slide, please. Thank you. So we can protect, but again, as planning is invariably negative, how do we then effectively get wharves working again. Because at the end of the day, a planning policy is good if it stops things happening, but a planning policy is better if it actually makes things happen. And therefore we look towards reactivation. Now the PLA has compulsory purchase powers. We have compulsorily purchased one wharf where we were successful, albeit, and I hesitate to say this, that the Department for Transport had an unfortunate few issues with wording in terms of that compulsory purchase order, and it was successfully challenged in the High Court. But the principle of CPO remains, and what we've done, this is a wharf in Erith in southeast London that is now the largest asphalt plant in London, for those who are interested. And we worked with them to ensure that the site was acquired. Again, this is in a relatively industrial area, albeit with some encroaching development. So we look to work in partnership with operators actually to get wharves going. There are only some now that are held by developers who clearly, despite the direction in place, the disparity of values between residential and industrial is so great that some developers will still bank on the hope value being there. Of course, the directions, the main aim was to limit and reduce this hope value. But because of the attractiveness of being next to the river, it's still there. So we still have to maintain the approach that we will use compulsory purchase powers, but to work with operators. The PLA has recently acquired 2 wharves in London and a wharf now in Kent in order to continue and maintain this use of cargo handling in London, because it needs an interventionist approach. If the PLA hadn't done it and hadn't worked with operators, it wouldn't have happened. If we hadn't intervened in planning, it wouldn't have happened. It was the PLA's role there in terms of the sort of facilitator and the promoter of the river in its widest concept, that worked with the Greater London Authority, TfL, actually to make this happen. So I think the first rule is it takes a long time to protect sites. The second rule is it takes a lot of vigilance and a lot of work actually to keep them protected and to get them reactivated. When it does happen, it's great, but it's a long slog. The next slide, please. And what we're now seeing, and again, you can tell that I do like moody screens, you know, shots there and pictures. I also like aggregates as well, but moody pictures for slides. We have 2 very large aggregate terminals in Greenwich. They handle between them getting on for 4 million tonnes every year. Road serve, river serve, rail serve, the largest marine dredged aggregate terminals in Europe. You can see the dome there in the distance. So these effectively on the east side of the Greenwich Peninsula. But again, because of the major regeneration of this area, we are faced with encroaching development near to the wharf. So this isn't a direct attempt to acquire the wharves for alternative development. It's actually the juxtaposition of development on working wharves. And this is perhaps the third and in some senses the most pernicious thing that we're seeing in terms of wharves. How we deal with development next to working terminals that, like these wharves here, work 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. And if people are aware of nuisance laws and statutory nuisance in particular, there is a major issue of people living next to the river, and I get a lot of emails that usually start, I love living next to the river, and you always wait for the but, and that but always comes, and it tends to be, why do boats have to go up and down it? They make noise, or it's annoying me that you hear noises from these terminals. Why you think, you know, you live next to a river, but anyway, I won't go down there. So what we're now looking to do through planning is actually to see what can we do to limit this juxtaposition. And again, this is something that's in planning policies. We've got the hook to do it. And without that planning hook, we couldn't engage with local planning authorities. But this site here is, let's say, with these major developments, we've got a large housing scheme immediately upstream. And by immediately, I mean 20 meters away from the boundary of the upstream of these wharves. Next slide, please. And you can see here on the right of the screen, where you see that the red boundary there is the site, which is the Greenwich Millennium Village phase 3 site. And you can see there their red line boundary of, you see sort of the housing there, the red line boundary, and then immediately to the other side, that is Angerstein Wharf, which is one of those two major aggregate terminals. You can see the proximity of that residential development to what is one of London's significant aggregates terminals. Because without aggregates, as I keep having to remind local planners, London doesn't get built. And so, we're the largest port for aggregates, about 9 or 10 million tons of sea-dredged aggregates and imported aggregates coming to London. And we need these facilities in order to process and to make concrete and added value processes. So you can see there the proximity of these two schemes. So the issue here was, well, how do we manage to actually minimize the opportunities for annoyance and complaints? And the next slide, please. And it took a fair bit of work. It actually started with us actually threatening to judicially review the local planning authority who just granted planning consent without looking at this issue in any detail. But when they naturally and understandably sort of climbed down, we then started looking with the developer, with the local planning authorities, particularly the environmental health officers and the terminals, how we can actually treat these the frontages of these developments in order to ensure that we didn't have that opportunity for complaint. And actually, it was a collaborative process. It took a long time. And of course, anyone who's involved in planning knows that glaciers move quicker to some degree than the planning process. But it was actually effectively what we came out with was a very simple solution, which was to effectively keep the residential, the living areas away from the frontage, to look then actually at how we fenestrated the frontage to the wharf and keeping the common parts and the service areas towards the wharf, and actually getting the scheme to look into itself and away from still to the river, but away from the terminals. And this took a long time, and obviously a lot of haggling, because again, it's a very nice view downstream to the Thames barrier and to the river. And that was something that we didn't want because of these opportunities for complaint, particularly from the habitable rooms, bedrooms, and living rooms. And again, also to look as well as how we dealt with purge ventilation, keeping windows closed, which again, as you'll imagine, comes as quite a shock to developers, but ensuring then that through closed windows and through fenestration, that the opportunities for noise, particularly at night, particularly in the summer, were limited. Next slide, please. And this finally is at the bottom there, actually the drawing of the fenestration towards the wharf. So still keeping an active frontage, but actually one that behind it really had lots of corridors and plants and working areas to the wharf. So actually we've maintained that juxtaposition, but not in a way that effectively just has a very dull flank wall, because it's not something, we're not looking to effectively close the wharves off from life, but actually to make it interesting. So I think this is the end. I think from my experience over almost 22 years of dealing with these, to say it's a long process, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort. The PLA invested in a planning department, there's only 3 of us, I should say, but a planning department, in order then that we can actually engage in planning. Because if you don't engage in planning in order to make these things happen, things will happen to you. And particularly on any river where people want to live, they like the river, but they might not like it the way that you like it. And you need to get involved. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jane. Absolutely fascinating. And I think we'll have so much to learn from you in terms of the Clyde, where our riverfronts are being eaten up by housing developers and all our infrastructure is disappearing. Thanks very much for that. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the chat once we've heard from. Next, David Barton from ABB Marine and Ports. So with a degree in maritime business and management, David has 14 years of experience with the maritime and port industries. He started his career with Babcock International, and after a variety of exciting projects, including the QEC aircraft carriers, oil and gas support, and port development, he is now at ABB as sales manager for marine systems in the UK and Ireland. David has developed ABB's aftermarket support business for government-owned vessels and automated container terminals such as Liverpool 2 and London Gateway. His focus now is on sustainable shipping, future trends towards electric propulsion, DC distribution, alternative energy sources, and autonomous systems. Thank you very much for joining us, David, and over to you.
Oh, thank you. I'll just try and share my presentation and get this right. Is that now sharing? Yeah.
That's
okay.
good.
No, brilliant. Thanks very much. Just before I start, just pick up on it. I'm going to be speaking predominantly about a single project that we've just agreed and signed for 10 new Lisbon fast ferries. But just a couple of things that we've sort of picked up already. Sean's really interesting in his presentation and has talked through about some of their vision going forward. What I don't want to confuse is we're looking at one project here with one solution. It's by no means the solution that is relevant for every application, and there's a lot of exciting things that I can see are going to happen down on the Thames. Also very nice to see a slide from James on the ship-to-shore cranes there at London Gateway. They have a lot of our automation systems on board, and remote controls and the drives and the motors. So I've been up there many a times, so very nice to see as well. Next slide. Okay, so just very quickly for those that don't know ABB, we're a multinational technology company that provides products and systems largely around electrification and automation. Very sizable company, and sort of on a competitor level with the likes of Siemens and GE amongst others. But we have a large product portfolio, but then we integrate that with direct systems for end users, and I represent our marine and ports business, which is one of 18 divisions within ABB. One of our big focuses within that is so we're focused on meeting IMO's goals of having greenhouse gas emissions from ships by 2050. But that's requiring comprehensive and proactive response from the maritime community. But we believe shipping is well positioned to take concrete action by choosing to implement the correct technologies that provide the reduced fuel consumption and lower emissions. Okay. Now, ABB's technologies are redefining the future, and we believe bring the new levels of reliability, efficiency, and sustainability. But we believe that shipping's future is electric, it's digital, and it is connected. The electrical backbone is integrated with automation and control systems, and is already transforming the industry with truly collaborative and automated operations. Digital solutions on board the vessel transmit data in real time and give comprehensive overview of the ship's performance to teams on board and ashore. And connectivity makes it possible to exploit advanced analytics that feed into tools for energy efficiency and maintenance optimization. So that's a little bit of an overview of our sort of global approach. But onto the project I've been asked to speak about today, which is 10 new vessels for 3 different routes in Lisbon. The main driver for this was they were to be fully electric and fully battery operated. Now, this is capable because of the size of the vessels that we're looking at here, which are around 40 meters long. They're twin-hulled, fiberglass construction, capable of carrying up to 540 passengers. From the elevation on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see in the red, these are the battery packs in configuration, some forward and some further aft. Permanent magnet propulsion motor at the back, driving the shafts. Okay, as batteries discharge in DC, it makes sense to utilize DC distribution to avoid the extra weight, space, and cost of that energy conversion. So we have a number of products and systems that showcase DC, including onboard microdrive. However, as these vessels are quite sizable and have head clearance, which is because of our product portfolio and how things fit within space envelopes, that was a key factor here and allowed us to use the more generic system. While these ferries have completely ditched the generators, DC also has a lot of wider benefits for hybrid and electric drive solutions. But this is a much wider discussion for a completely other day. One of the most interesting things about this, though, is we have 3 different routes that had to be accommodated with very different crossing times. That has a huge impact on charging cycles and battery capacity. And the key driver in the specification was to be able to operate for 70 minutes at 16 knots, not utilizing more than 70% of the available battery size. Okay, very sorry, I've had to actually redact at the very last minute some of the drawings, because when I realized that we were being recorded today, because there was a little bit of IP in there, which I'm not allowed to fully share. But ultimately, we're driving 2 permanent magnet propulsion motors, 1 on each side, and there are 30 62 kilowatt hour batteries, 62 kilowatt being about average typical size for a current EV car. So basically 30 cars worth of batteries in each vessel. Our overall scope is wrapped up around an automation package. So we have the power energy management system, we have a wider vessel management system, thruster controls and joystick controls. And then on the wider hardware front, we have our DC grid switchboards. We have hotel transformers with filters. So this allows us to convert back into AC to do local distribution for lighting and onboard services. We have the permanent magnet propulsion motors. We've supplied the Corvus Dolphin batteries, Corvus being one of the largest battery manufacturers in the world. But where we sort of start is we start and we do the initial sizing of the batteries, the capability, look at some of the chemistry options, look at those weight parameters, how we could configure those, and then we work with the battery suppliers into the detailed design. We've also supplied the on-port part of the Zinus connector. So Zinus are going to be providing the charging infrastructure. And if I just nip to, well, I'll show you on to the next slide, but we're providing 2 boxes, 1 on each side, which will allow that plug-in ultimately for the connection, and a little bit more detail on that later on. Right now, as part of the initial contract, we're only providing the batteries for a single vessel. And this is because there's a huge amount of different commercial options that can be taken up on battery ownership, battery leasing, and the client is currently evaluating how they want to do that best. The 2 hulls are completely independent systems, so there's no active tie connection between the 2 DC grid lineups. So on the right here, you'll see these are one side per hull each. They can be tied together in a failure event. However, they're managed independently to the point where they're charged independently as well. So on the left-hand side here of the single line diagram, you'll see this is the requirements for the shore infrastructure, which is sizable. And this is one of the major challenges with this overall concept and project. Again, a little bit more details later on, but here you have AC to DC grid transformers, rectifiers, and each of these units will be in a prefabricated or into room or into an existing space, but each of those is around 10 meters long of equipment. So it's a sizable footprint that needs to be taken cognizance of with any of the planning. Okay. So a little bit more about the routes. Apologies, my pronunciation will be probably quite offensive for the name of all of the terminals, so hopefully I don't offend anyone. But ultimately, they are all serving in and around the same terminal in Lisbon, and you have 3 different crossings from the colours there. 5-minute crossing, 7,000 trips per year to Casillas, 7,900 trips on a 19-minute crossing down to Sexol, and then at the longest crossing and the most challenging, therefore, for the battery sizing is the Montijo, which is just short of 7,000 trips per year on the half-hour crossing. And it is that cycle time that is the problem, because we've got these 3 different routes. There are 3 very different operational profiles, so making that cycle time and the charging implications that run with that. It's that whole operational balancing act that then needs to take place around speed, size, battery sizes, the technology considerations. And one of the parameters here was that the batteries had to be able to operate for 7 years. So you have to juggle that entire balancing act. Now, the big way that we saw this going forward and the way around this was that you could look at a different vessel for every different route, which has a different battery size. But then what happens if you have a failure and you have to move one vessel from one route to another and it's not physically capable of doing so? So all vessels are being built on exactly the same footprint with exactly the same batteries. But because of then the cycle and discharge time, we will move those vessels around the routes to better protect the batteries. Okay, so one of the other key considerations is the actual space envelope and the infrastructure you have, especially when developing existing infrastructure. So this is the main hub in Lisbon. Hugely congested site, the 3 separate floating jetties which serve the 3 separate routes. And there's a number of challenges that have to be overcome here. So first of all, each of these is a floating pontoon. They are class registered and they have to be docked every 5 years. There isn't currently a spare, so that then means you're having to put 3 routes across two of the jetties, which when you are then having to do charging cycles could have an impact on your operations. And just on the land side, as I said, we're going to have potentially require 3 charging stations here. That could, so up to 6 basically mini substations that are doing all of that power capability that's then driving to the shore connections. That land is very, very tight and it's going to have to be either built up or taken out of some of the existing requirements. Now, these are the 3 destinations or embarkation points. So ultimately, very similar to Thames Clipper, this is part of an integrated sort of regional transport infrastructure. It's deemed sort of almost part and parcel of some of those routes and multimodal and connected. And each of them have their own challenges or not, because this is actually the biggest challenge here. Looking to put the charging infrastructure here, but physically there is no space at present. But the other 2 are ultimately large parking lots to allow commuters to move in and out of the city. And here, much easier to put that charging infrastructure in place without really any major challenges. It's worth noting though that this project's moved forward, we're on contract, but not all of these wider challenges have necessarily been resolved and are still in work in progress. So it's certainly something that anyone looking at a development, it's worth knowing how you're going to get your solution fully covered off. Mention the charging system. So the selected model is, or company is called Zinus. Now, they currently have a number of installations. The one here on the left, again, we've got infrastructure on board this ferry. I'm not even going to attempt the name of it. And this is the charging box here, remotely operated, because these are LV solutions, the cables are quite large, they're very heavy and cumbersome. And because of the standards that are used now as well, there's multiple cables. It's not just a single cable that's getting handled on board each connection. But this is about trying to charge as quickly as you can. So these systems allow a pretty quick connection. We have done other solutions where there was a very short crossing where we were only having 2 or 3 minutes of charge time. Very similar to the Gosport ferry down in Portsmouth, that kind of very quick river crossing. In that implication, we've actually used our robotic arms, and that's connecting to the vessel with the shore connection prior to it actually being made fast alongside to maximize that time. A little bit more about the battery lineup. One of the first slides I showed, there were we had some forward and some aft in each hold. There are 5 pack arrangements all together, 1024 volts in 8 modules per setup. These are IP44 rated, and a lot of consideration has to actually just go into their arrangement because of the weight that Sean mentioned earlier. There's a sizable mass that's being put in the hull of these vessels, and a lot of considerations need to take place. Again, this is then when it comes to possibly the biggest challenge, and this is about maintaining the capability of the batteries and not damaging them. So, as we said, we want to operate 60 knots for 70 minutes with the batteries between 90 and 20%. We never want to top them up beyond 90% because you're then damaging the battery. Much harder to ram that energy in there as well. So it's really not as efficient. But to maintain this, what we're actually looking on the sizing is we don't want to discharge more than 25% of the battery at any one time. 20% is about ideal, 25% is the maximum. So if we were to do much bigger dips down here, we would be shortening the life of the battery by exponentially, really. So this is the main dimensioning factor. And as is, the other thing is then about the charge time. So we've been given a maximum of 10 minutes charging for the longest crossing. So again, that's a lot of the design work that has to go into that, is how you're going to make that work. So as I said earlier, we're going to cycle the vessels across so that none of them are being this large, heavy discharge that you see on the right-hand side here. And as they cycle around, they'll be able to be maintained a little bit better. Okay, and very quickly, we are obviously not building these ferries. We are providing power and propulsion systems. Our systems will be integrated with a company called Gondon within their GRP division. They're a Spanish-based builder. Family owned in their 3rd generation. They have 2 yards next to each other, a very traditional shipyard, and one which is GRP specific, where they have about 50 employees, and they've been building fast ferry catamarans for around 10 years. And just one final slide is another project. So, I mean, this is not the only one we're working on right now. We've delivered, or in the process of delivering, new tourist ferries at Niagara Falls, Made of the Mist, again, fully battery powered. We have a vessel in Norway called Vision of the Fjords, one of the first battery powered vessels. And recently, we've just announced a pilot contract with Busan Port Authority. Again, there'll be a mixture of requirements here, around 40-meter cats, 100 passengers, but there's negotiations ongoing for potentially up to 140 vessel renewal over the next 10 to 15 years. So some very, very exciting times. And there's a lot of fantastic technologies out there that are available, can be implemented in all manner of configurations. It's just looking at it holistically and understanding your goals and objectives and what you want to achieve. And that's me.
Wonderful, David. Thank you so much. Those look beautiful. They're beautifully designed as well as being sustainable. So can I just thank all of our three presenters. I'm sure everybody will be desperate to ask questions, and I'm going to hand back to Ian to take us through the questions and answers.
Thank you, Liz, and thanks very much again to our guest panelists today for those really interesting and detailed presentations. So if anyone would like to ask any questions, you can either raise your hand if you'd like to speak out loud, and you can turn your video on if you'd like to, or if you'd like to post your questions in the chat, I'll read them out.
In the absence of anyone else getting started, can I maybe pose a question to Sean?
Yes, please carry on.
Sean, I understand that you have very different parameters to the vessels that I just shown, but just interested why you're looking at hydrogen and fuel cells, and why Thames Clipper see that as being your near future.
The simple answer to that is that the battery capacity required to operate on the Thames to navigate the challenging tides, the weight would be far too much. We wouldn't be able to carry hardly any passengers.
Yeah.
We need a similar sort of kilowatt hour to what you have intimated for the ferries that you're providing for Lisbon, but equally our operating cycle, completing even just one round trip on the longest route is nearly 2 hours. And we're a commercial operation, we're not state funded. And you know, within that, we've got to think about wash. So the hulls have got to be extremely slender. And we're operating in a different flag state as well. We're governed by the Maritime and Coast Guard Agency, and their requirement for our operation is to operate under the High Speed Craft Code. So we've looked into trying to put that jigsaw together, but unfortunately, there's a lot of pieces missing.
Yeah, no.
Good. And I have a question for both Sean and Jim. It's about speed limits on the River Thames. How do you overcome these? Are these an issue at all?
For us, on operating on the Thames, we are governed in navigation by the Port of London Authority, and we operate under a special permit, as do other high-speed craft, and we have to adhere to passage plans that are approved by the Port Authority that allow us to operate at high speed in certain areas and at low speed, and then govern where we have to operate at low speed. And we're pretty much at 12 knots and below within central London, and then we have to adhere to all the sort of ad hoc ease downs that there may be, similar to that what you'd expect on other waterways like Southampton Water, Red Funnel.
I think Sean's summed that up very well, really. I mean, I think if we look at existing freight services, if we just use freight being my particular interest, for bulk materials, it tends to be into London on the flood tide, out on the ebb tide, and therefore making use of both the increase in tide as you come up, because a lot of the berths are drying, and effectively free energy. And that's the way, of course, that a lot of the shippings happen since the Roman time, so it can't be all wrong. I think the next issue will be we're looking to take advantage of the river's potential, as I said, an east-west corridor, then from international gateways into the main consumer areas for light freight. And by that, we mean consolidation, last mile deliveries. And Sean, of course, is actually running one of those small packet services for DHL, which of course we didn't mention because it's about passengers. But, you know, this is the approach. And clearly, if we look to encourage that type of trade, it's a lot more just in time. It isn't, you know, bulk services tend to be high volume, low margins. If we look then in terms of consolidation last mile, it's high volume, and high volume and high margins, but on the base of just in time. So it's then how we can manage to deal with that, with tides and with the natural speed limits that we have to have in place, obviously on a busy urban waterway, to actually make that work. So I think for us, in terms of freight, it's actually away from speed limits in their own sense to what can we do then in terms of capacity to actually flex where we need to encourage more use.
Good, thank you. And I have a question in the chat from Gary Smith, and this is for Sean. He says, interesting you're going step by step, i.e. diesel, hybrid, then electric, rather than jump straight to full electric, which I totally agree with. If you use fully certified stage 5 diesel engines and operate them correctly, i.e. using the torque curve correctly, the emissions are drastically reduced.
Yeah, I couldn't agree. Yeah, couldn't agree more. It's, you know, we're a commercial operation. We cannot take any significant risk in our development. And you know, we're also in the planning and design of those diesel electric hybrid vessels, looking to how we can then subsequently retrofit once we go down the fuel cell route. But you know, we've got to have the supply of green hydrogen, and we've got to have the interface and the fueling systems and everything else. And you know, and it's great that the Port of London Authority are very much working collaboratively and independently in trying to ensure that the facilities are going to be there to be able to support such developments for the future. And you know, it's really important that it's a changing world, and we're never going to be able to achieve this tailpipe zero globally and on all, you know, terrains, as it were, without collaboration. And you know, what you know, where David's product doesn't suit for many of my routes, it does for others, and equally mine that we're developing will not be necessary for certain routes, but it will be very much necessary for others. So you know, we're only going to, you know, you look at the wind farm industry, you know, they are having to go down the same route as what we are. You know, they're operating to codes that are probably not so applicable in certain domestic flag states. But you know, we've got to work with what we've got, and equally flag states have got to develop as well and move with the times and help us to accommodate the future requirements safely. You know, and that's the key here. We cannot reduce the safety levels and expose ourselves to anything that could remove that. So it's important, very important, that we work collaboratively with all of our regulators to ensure that we're going to be delivering a sustainable product. And so that's one of the reasons why we're taking a stepped approach to this.
If I can just also then come in again for Sean, and I think it's right that, again, our role in this as the Port Authority, and there is an amount of information and studies on our website if people are interested, is actually, again, to facilitate, to work collaboratively, as Sean says, that we can try and help operators to avoid making poor decisions. And clearly in this sort of new gold rush that we're in terms of fuels, technology, where we're going, without guidance and help, it's going to be potluck. And so for us, that means firstly with a roadmap in terms of what the vessels are going to need, and now work we're looking at, which is effectively supply and demand of alternative fuels, so we can actually look to hopefully provide bunkers of what people need where they need it. Because otherwise I can't see that the chicken and egg of you know, we have new fuels, but we can't have, there's no facilities to provide them, and we can't provide facilities because no one wants them. We're never going to break that otherwise.
It's a very good point that Jim makes there, because at the end of the day, if you look at the charter business on the Thames, you look at the vast majority of the tourism, the river tours, they're operating over a very, very short distance. So the battery concept will work extremely well for them. You know, they spend quite a long time alongside the piers whilst waiting to load their passengers. And so there are opportunities to develop there very differently to how we've got to develop. And then a tug and you know, the tugs that are carrying, you know, hundreds and hundreds of lorry loads along the river on a daily basis are going to need the similar sort of product as to us. So, you know, there is going to be all different sorts of fueling points, as it were, moving forward. And we're not going to get anywhere unless we all talk and work together to make sure that there is a nozzle for everyone.
If you don't mind me adding as well, the other thing to sort of be very mindful of with all of these is that everything is changing on a sort of a weekly, monthly basis, and the technology development and advancement is quite scary at times in how things are moving forward. And, you know, long lead sort of gestation periods for projects need to be mindful about that path and where things will go. So yes, about different fuel types and different nozzles and what will happen, but also about the capabilities of what some of those systems will be, the sort of reduction in size or whatever. And we're seeing a lot of a move for people looking at fit to receive. So they may still be very reliant on their diesels today, but they are designing their electrical infrastructure that will allow them to combine different alternative power sources tomorrow, and being able to change those 10 years later down the line as well without doing full scale intervention. And it's sort of mapping and planning for what those changes could be as well.
And of course, the classic way, sorry, that technology is advancing far quicker than regulation. And that, of course, is all, as is the way, of course. And that is where people end up in trouble, in that they're adopting solutions that there is no, well, in some cases with the MC, there is actually no regulation for, let alone the regulation being drafted.
Yeah.
You know, and it's a very good point, because you know, people, I was only asked the other day, you know, our fleet is the youngest fleet on the Thames, and you know, that some of the vessels are still, well, the oldest of vessels, with the exception of 3, have probably still got a 15 to 20 year lifespan. And so therefore, you know, I was asked the question, will you be operating diesel engines post 2030? The answer was yes, but the way things are developing, it's not to say that we can't retrofit those existing vessels to be able to operate Tailpipe Zero, because the technology is developing. You know, you look back, everybody uses the phone example, but you look back not that long ago, people were carrying around bricks with them in order to make a mobile call. Now they're doing everything else as well as making a call on something not much bigger than a wallet that they used to carry around, full of cash, because they don't need that no more. They've got, you know, everything's contactless. But, you know, just putting that into perspective, you know, evolution is going to inevitably allow retrofit of older vessels, and so, you know, we can't just rush into this development. It's got to be sustainable, and you know, 5-6 years is not that long to ensure that we've got a sustainable future and safe future.
Good, thank you. And I have a question for James from Robert McCaig. And he's asking, were London Port Authority able to make use of GTA grandfather rights or Sustainable Use Directive?
Let me just check that. Sorry, is that in the chat?
Yeah.
Effectively, we can to an extent, and a lot of the terminals we have on the river are working on the basis of very old consents, if they're even written consents at all. So I think on the basis of this sort of pre-47, pre-planning control. They work to an extent as long as you keep things the same rather than any intensification, basically bring in planning control. It works okay to perhaps keep hours, particularly hours of use, where we've got terminals at 24/7, particularly upstream. They don't stop issues of EHO, environmental health, and statutory noise nuisance is one where certainly we've had to go to court to help operators at least twice. And therefore you can rely to an extent on some old planning, grandfather consents, some on permitted development for consents, but the weight of public opinion or volume of emails is harder to resist. And again, it needs, as I've said, this sort of vigilance and letting operators do it by themselves and individual terminals fight battles by themselves is easy to do, but I don't think is a sustainable option in the future, which again is why I think hopefully, as I've said for everything, it needs collaboration to make anything happen now, certainly to fight a corner and certainly in planning. And so alliances, hopefully with someone who's, sort of a big picture who can provide some resources and individuals actually to work together. Otherwise, it's a lone voice and it's a lot harder.
Okay, good, thank you. And I have another question from Robert McCaig. This is for Sean. And he's asking, can I ask for downriver, would you be able to navigate, for example, to Tilbury Cruise Terminal to tie in with direct transfer from cruise ship excursions? And if you can or do, would this be economical?
The answer to that is yes. And we're very much, again, developing our fleet to be able to support that route expansion. And that is not too far away. But once again, we have to ensure that our fleet have got the optimum hull efficiencies and are as light as possible in order to navigate that long stretch against a head-on tide. We can't take an hour one day and an hour and 30 the next because the tide's in a different direction. We've got to be consistent, and so we've got to juggle all of those different characteristics and culminate with a common package. We do need common efficiencies within our fleet, and David's point earlier on is it makes total sense the way Lisbon are approaching their fleet flexibility, and that's something that we're doing, and indeed the vessels that we will be able to operate to those extremities will some of them will also be able to go up all the way up to Putney, where at times we have got on that RB6 route less than a metre to navigate into the piers, and less than half a metre air clearance underneath the bridges, and on a surge tide, not even that. So I think that we've got to recognise here in the UK that we are leading from an industry perspective in this technology, from a marine perspective. It's really important that side of our industry, because it's not just about operating them, it's developing them, building them, and maintaining them. And a focus on our shipping industry for construction is really important. you know, we're really fortunate now that we're able to build our boats here in the UK. The vast majority of our fleet were built in Australia because they were cutting edge. And, you know, ironically, the other day I got a question posed to me and said, you know, can we use the design of one of your vessels, our latest vessels, in a location in Australia that is very familiar to transporting by water, because they wanted to expand their network. And our vessels, they haven't got a vessel suitable to be able to navigate those new routes, but ours ticks that box. You know, so it's, you know, it is going to open up the opportunity for expansion of river transport. And it, you know, if we can do that, it's like buses. You know, we're never going to be able to design an off-the-shelf boat because every city, every country, every flag state, and every river has different demographics and geographics and rules. So we're not going to be able to create a one shoe fits all. But I'd like to think through this process, we will be able to develop a selection of shoes that can be used in various aspects.
Good, thank you. Robert McCaig has another question for David, and he's asking, from your experience with ABB on electric propulsion on passenger ferries, are class societies moving along at suitable pace with regards to any new or revised class notations?
I probably can't give the most detailed answer on that. I don't have the huge amount of experience in there. What I would say is that we are engaged with most class societies and the likes of the IMO, and we help to push and mold and guide some of that guidance on what the technologies that we can bring and others, and how that will need to be then integrated within those rules. Whether we're successful or not at that, I can't comment, I'm afraid. I'm quite new in my new role, so I haven't delved into that.
Okay, good, thanks. And I have a question for Sean, and it's about ticketing on the Thames Clippers. Are you able to identify how passengers are using connections with other modes of transport? How many passengers are coming, for example, from buses or tubes onto the Thames Clippers?
Yes, I mean, we Transport for London can do that. You know, we can't. We haven't got access to that detail. Only for when they're using our, you know, our product. But obviously TfL have got a visual of that wider connectivity. And I think, you know, the answer to that is historically very, very low percentage of our usage is intermodal. I think that's changing by the day, and I think probably the most common intermodal change is going to be the bike, the cycle, moving forward, and the e-scooter and everything else that is coming down the track from surface transport perspective. But yes, we can, or Transport for London can track that. But we can't. But what we can track is the routing of what passengers make, and so that helps us make commercial decisions, management decisions, and supply decisions.
Very good. And do TfL, do they make that data available to transport operators so that they can plan their services?
No, they don't, unless we request any specific reason that we would request that. And unfortunately, the cycle hire system doesn't necessarily take the same payment method. It's normally done through an app. So So that doesn't help us. But if we wanted to understand the development of a route or the demand of a route, then yes, we can apply for that information. And it works the other way. You know, we supply data to them through our footfall routing.
Okay, good, thank you. I'm almost out of time, but I do have one more question for, this is for Jim, and from your presentation, it seems quite clear that there's been a lot of joined up thinking across the board and at all levels in terms of planning, so that you allow for housing development and wharves, industrial use on the river. And this is something that we're definitely lacking on the Clyde. How vital would you say that has been for the Thames in terms of both cargo and passenger transport?
It's very kind to say there's a lot of joined up thinking. So I have to say some of the time the legs are going like mad, but you don't sit above the surface. I think having seen both models, the big change for us was the mayor, and actually a directly elected mayor with executive planning powers. Now, the London mayor doesn't have, you know, widespread, massive powers, but in terms of planning, they are quite broad. And without that regional perspective to actually see what is right for the whole of London, rather than an individual borough perspective, what is right for my borough and sod the rest, if we're being honest, politically in any way, actually, that has been the change. If it was individual boroughs just looking after their own patch, then it would have been far harder to maintain a unified approach that we deal with as well in West London as East London, North and South. So actually, for us, it's a regional planning system, which we didn't have when I joined. We have now, and hopefully we will continue to have. But without linking at that level and then down to the boroughs and actually some form of control, as it were, and coordination, far harder.
I'd just like to add to that. When the previous mayor appointed, and he didn't for his first term, it was in his second term. Is
that the previous mayor who went on to other things? Sure.
That's correct. And he appointed in his second term, he developed a vision, a plan for the Thames, and predominantly focused on transport in the way of passengers. But he appointed an ambassador to the river that reported directly into him. And that was one of the best things that ever happened to us as a business and to the river from a passenger perspective. We grew so much in passenger numbers overnight when that started happening. New routes were established. And, you know, if you're looking at sort of trying to shape planning, trying to shape local government or whatever, I would strongly suggest that, because if we had that now and we had it focusing on freight, light logistics and for passengers, it would make things so much easier, and it wouldn't be a lone voice like it is so often for the likes of Jim that are just constantly banging on doors trying to get the understanding and recognition of what needs to happen. You know, that would help so much to have a collective funnel, a funneling of collective view.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we are out of time now. I'm sure we could talk about these issues all day. But if you'd like to find out more about our panelists and their organisations, you can see their websites. It's Thames Clipper.
Taking questions, Ian.
Sorry, we are out of time. Sorry, we can take one more question if you have a question.
Could I ask a question?
Yes, carry on.
Hello. Afternoon. I'm kind of a layperson here. My first question would be to Sean and James about the size of the Clyde compared with the size of the Thames. Would it work in the Clyde?
So I'm sorry, I'm struggling to understand that question. You
Well,
don't.
You've got the Thames, which is incredible and allows commercial ships to work as well as the ones you have. Would it work in the Clyde? Because the Clyde is technically, I think, about 30 meters across.
Is that all the way? Is that all the way? Is that all the way up though? Because obviously, I mean, you know, the rivers, you know, obviously it gets smaller and shallower as it heads upstream.
Yeah.
And we get, you know, passenger vessels up to Putney, and there, you know, you've got the main channel that's wet, but clearly the foreshore does dry quite significantly. Clearly, you need some water in there to get things going. But people, I think, are quite surprised. And you know, Sean operating, you know, what draft your vessel, Sean, in quite small water?
0.8 of a meter. I mean, I you know, I understand the question now, and you know, I've been on the Clyde. I've visited the area throughout the potential navigational geography, and you know, you're right in that it hasn't got the shipping, but that doesn't mean to say that it couldn't develop the passenger and light logistics concept that we have sort of elaborated on today, and adopt the environmentally developing propulsion systems to support that long term.
Okay, my question to David, Scotland really has no money. So would a company like yours come in and help develop it?
That question, David.
Well, ultimately, there is a lot of investment in Scotland in the marine infrastructure space. If you look at what Seamal are about to be doing with new Isle of Islay ferries, new passenger ferries as well. Ultimately, we won't bankroll or finance anything. We're a commercial entity, but we do work in partnership and look at ways that we can support projects moving forward. But we're a system and equipment provider, and we
I know I've kind of put you on the spot, but we've seen development in Aberdeen. We'd like to see the same in Glasgow. You know, just simple as that. And it would need private money.
Yeah, but that's not where ABB would come in. Ultimately, you would need an operator that's looking to develop a solution. And obviously in Scotland, there's a mix there of private operators and state supported operators. Where that would fit best is there an economic need, and with either private funding, someone, you know, willing to take a punt, put their business brain behind it and make it work like Sean has, or does it require some level of state sponsorship? That's a whole wider discussion.
Yeah, it needs everything. Yeah, it needs everything. Because people need employment, and then communities can develop. Thank you for answering the question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for your question, Alex. And I think definitely this is a very high level discussion involving a lot of stakeholders, and it's something that would take kind of months and maybe a couple of years to get into the detail. Unfortunately, we do have to wrap up now. We are over time.
Thank you for the interesting questions, and it's been a pleasure.
You can find more about
the very best of luck to you. The very best of luck to you from me as well.
Thank you. And you can find more about our panelists on their websites, thamesclippers.com, pla.co.uk and abb.com. And if you'd like to find out more about the Sustainable Shipping webinar series or the projects that we're involved with, you can get in touch. The recording of this webinar will be available soon on the Clyde.Scot website. And we also have a LinkedIn group for Clyde Sustainable Shipping. If anyone would like to join, you can join on LinkedIn. And again, the upcoming webinars will be scheduling shortly, looking at vessel design and build, ship operations, sail cargo, import and export markets, tourism and policy. And so thank you all again for coming along today, and thanks so much again to our guest panelists for the really interesting presentations, and we hope to see you all again at future webinars.